The executioner's axe was already rising when the Alpha King said stop. He did not shout it. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, low, level, absolute, and the word moved through the courtyard faster than the axe could fall. The executioner froze with his arms still lifted. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped and was hushed. Fenna knelt where she had been placed, hands bound in front of her, the block cold against her folded knees, and she did not look up, because she had already made her peace with not looking up again. Her name was Fenna. 6 days ago she had been nobody in particular, a copyist in the lower archive, the kind of woman whose ink-marked fingers were the most notable thing about her, if anyone had bothered to notice anything about her at all. 6 days ago she had opened a ledger she was not meant to open and read 3 lines she was not meant to read, and by nightfall she had been arrested for treason she had not committed, on the word of a woman who had never once looked her in the eye. She had not screamed. She had not begged. She had simply gone very quiet, the way she always did when the world decided something about her, without asking, and let them lead her to the block, with her wrists wrapped in the same grey linen she had worn every day of her adult life, and no one, not the guards, not the priest, not the crowd assembled to watch, had thought to ask why a copyist bandaged both wrists so carefully in a season, with no cold to explain it. The Alpha King had not been expected. He had been 3 days from the capital when the summons reached him. A treason trial, concluded before he could weigh in, a sentence already signed by the council in his absence. He had ridden through the night. He had arrived with mud to his knees, and no explanation for why, and when he reached the courtyard wall, and saw the block, and the kneeling woman, and the axe already lifted, something in him that had no name moved before his mind caught up to it, and the word left him before he decided to say it. Stop. The crowd turned. The council turned. Lady Octavia Vance, seated in the shaded gallery where she had watched the proceedings with the composed patience of a woman who has already won, did not turn so much as she went very still. The way a woman goes still when a plan she built for months develops a crack she had not accounted for. Your Grace, her voice carried, pleasant and precise, pitched for the crowd rather than for him. The council's ruling was lawful. The matter is concluded. The matter, said the Alpha King, is not concluded until I have seen the evidence myself. He crossed the courtyard on foot, which no one expected. An Alpha King did not walk into a public execution. He arrived already positioned, already elevated, already separate from the crowd he ruled. But he walked, boots loud on the frozen stone, until he stood over the kneeling woman and looked down at her for the first time. She still did not look up. Her hands were shaking, very slightly, and she was holding them as still as she could to hide it, which was its own kind of tell. "Look at me," he said. Not a command. Something closer to a request he did not know how to phrase as one. She looked up, grey eyes, steady despite everything, despite the axe and the crowd, and the 6 days of a cell that smelled of stone and rot, steady in a way that made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. He had seen fear in every possible register in his years as king. He had never quite seen this. A woman who had decided, privately and completely, that she would not give her terror an audience. "What is your name?" he said. "Fenna." Her voice did not shake, though her hands did. "Fenna Marrow, Your Grace, 3rd copyist to the Western Archive. And you read something you should not have. I read something someone did not want read." Her chin lifted, fractionally. "That is not the same crime." A ripple went through the gallery. Lady Octavia's composed smile did not move, but her eyes had gone sharp and fast, doing the arithmetic of a woman recalculating. The Alpha King crouched, so that he was no longer looking down at her, which cost him something visible in front of his entire court. An Alpha King did not lower himself to the level of a condemned prisoner, and every adviser watching understood exactly what it meant that he had. He reached for her bound wrists, meaning only to examine the ropes, and his fingers brushed the edge of the grey linen bandage she wore beneath them, and he felt something under it that was not skin. A ridge, a shape, old scar tissue or something older than that. "What is this?" he said quietly, for her alone. "Nothing," she said, too fast. He did not believe her. He had spent 9 years learning the specific sound of a lie told by someone who has told very few lies in her life, and hers had that unpracticed quality, too quick, too flat. But he did not press it in front of the court. He straightened, and when he spoke again, it was to the gallery, and his voice had gone from private to absolute. "This execution is stayed pending my own review of the evidence. Return the prisoner to the keep, under my personal guard." Lady Octavia rose from her seat with the unhurried grace of a woman refusing to let panic show in her posture. "Your Grace, the council convened without me," he said, "and will reconvene with me. That is not a request, Lady Octavia." He did not look at her again. He looked at Fenna, still kneeling at the block, with her wrists bound, and her wrapped arm cradled slightly against her body, in a way he now understood she had been doing since the moment they dragged her into the courtyard. "Get her up," he said to his guard. "Gently." The archive was where the trouble had started, and it was where the Alpha King went first, before he went to see her again, before he did anything else. Not the western wing where she had worked. The deep vault beneath it, where the oldest records of the realm were kept by a single archivist, so ancient that no one quite remembered when he had been appointed, and no one much cared to ask. The archivist's name was Orsin, and he had the particular fearlessness of a man who has outlived every reason to defer to rank. He did not rise when the Alpha King entered. He simply looked up from the table where he had been working, adjusted his spectacles, and said, "You've come about the girl. I've come about a mark on her wrist that she is lying about." Orsin's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "Ah, then you've come about the girl." He rose slowly, joints protesting, and moved to a shelf so far back in the vault that dust had settled undisturbed for what looked like a generation. He drew out a record bound in cracked leather, its pages the colour of old tea, and set it on the table between them, with the care of a man handling something that might dissolve if breathed on wrong. "The right of sanctuary blood," Orsin said. "Do you know it? A children's story. A law from before the founding courts, that certain bloodlines could not be tried, could not be executed, could not be bound against their will by any court in the realm. I was taught it does not exist any more, that it was abolished. It was not abolished." Orsin turned the pages with a careful finger, until he reached one marked with a symbol. A closed eye, drawn in faded ink, the lashes rendered in a fine, deliberate hand. It was allowed to sleep, because there was no one left to invoke it. The mark passes through blood, Your Grace, and the bloodline it protects has not surfaced, not once, not in any court, not in any record, in 289 years. The Alpha King looked at the symbol, a closed eye. "You think she carries it?" "I think," said Orsin, "that a woman who has spent her entire adult life bandaging both wrists in every season, in every weather, working a trade that requires bare hands and clean fingers, has a reason for it that has nothing to do with modesty. I think you should ask her yourself, before the council reconvenes and finishes what it started." She was in the east wing when he found her, not the cell they had returned her to, but a small windowed room he had ordered, prepared instead, because something in him had refused to let her spend another night in stone. She sat very still on the edge of the bed, her wrists finally unbound, the grey bandage still wrapped tight over the left one, and she was doing the thing he had already come to recognize in the short time he had known her, holding her hands motionless in her lap, flat and still, the specific stillness of someone managing fear by refusing to let it show in her body. She did not startle when he entered. She simply looked up, the same steady grey, and said, Have you come to finish what the court started, Your Grace? I've come to ask you what is under the bandage. Her jaw tightened. Nothing that concerns the crown. Everything you carry concerns the crown at present. That is rather the difficulty you find yourself in. She looked away from him, toward the narrow window, and for a long moment she said nothing, and he did not fill the silence with anything, because some part of him understood that filling it would only give her a reason to keep it closed. My mother wrapped it the day I was born, she said finally, quiet. She told me if anyone ever saw it, I would be taken from her. She never told me why. She died when I was 9, and I kept wrapping it because I did not know what else to do with the only instruction she ever gave me that mattered. May I see it? She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he understood she was deciding something larger than whether to show him a scar. And then she unwound the linen herself, slowly, her fingers steady now in a way they had not been at the block, because this, at least, was a fear she had lived with long enough to have mastered the shape of it. The mark was old and pale against her skin, unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably drawn rather than accidental. A closed eye, the lashes fine and exact, exactly as Orsin's record had shown it. The Alpha King went very still. Something moved in him that was not entirely his own decision. The same wolf-deep instinct that had said stop before his mind had chosen the word, and this time it did not push him toward her. It simply went quiet and attentive, the way a hound goes quiet at a scent it has been waiting its whole life to catch. He did not shift. He wanted to. That was almost worse. The specific discipline of holding a transformation at bay, while every instinct beneath his ribs strained toward the woman in front of him. "Do you know what this is?" he said, and his voice had gone rough in a way he did not entirely control. "No. It is the mark of the rite of sanctuary blood." He said it slowly, watching her face for any flicker of recognition, and finding none, only confusion, and beneath the confusion, something that looked almost like grief, as if she had just understood that her mother's silence had been protecting her from something enormous rather than something shameful. "No court in this realm can try you, sentence you, or execute you while that mark is visible and verified. It has not been invoked in 289 years. There is no one left who remembers what it looks like on living skin, except apparently the archivist and now me." "That cannot be why they wanted me dead," she said very quietly. "They didn't know it existed. Lady Octavia couldn't have known." "No," he agreed, "which means she wanted you dead for an entirely different reason. And this mark is simply the accident that is about to save your life, in spite of her." The council chamber the following morning was fuller than it had been for the trial itself, because word had travelled the way word always travelled in a capital built on gossip and stone corridors. The Alpha King had stopped an execution with his own hand, and the woman he stopped it for carried something on her wrist that no one currently living had ever seen invoked. Lady Octavia sat in her customary place, composed, dressed in the deep blue that made her look every inch the trusted adviser she had spent a decade building herself into. She did not fidget. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited for her moment with the patience of a woman who had survived worse setbacks than one delayed execution. "Your Grace," she said, when the chamber quieted, "whatever mark this woman carries does not change the substance of the charge. She read privileged correspondence belonging to this council. That correspondence detailed troop movements along the northern border. She then attempted to pass what she read to a foreign contact. There is no evidence of the second claim, the Alpha King said, only your account of it. My account, and the ledger in question, which I am happy to produce. Then produce it. A flicker, barely visible, gone almost as soon as it appeared, crossed Lady Octavia's face. It has been misplaced during the transfer of evidence, Your Grace. These things happen in busy weeks. Convenient, said Orsin, from where he stood at the chamber's edge, uninvited and entirely unbothered by that fact. I recall the ledger clearly enough. having catalogued it myself 11 years ago. It was not troop correspondence. It was a private accounting of funds moved from the Northern Garrison budget into 3 accounts that do not appear in any registry I have access to. I imagine Lady Octavia has access to registries I do not. The chamber went very quiet. The girl found what she was never meant to find, Orson continued, mild as ever, as though he were reading weather patterns rather than dismantling a decade of careful theft in front of the assembled council. She did not understand what it meant. I do. I have understood it for some time. I simply required a reason compelling enough to say so out loud, and a condemned woman with an ancient mark on her wrist proved to be exactly compelling enough. Fenna, seated where she had been placed at the chamber's edge, felt something like the ground tilting beneath her. She had not known. She had genuinely, entirely not known what she had read that night. Only that the numbers had not matched the figures she copied every week, and that something about the mismatch had troubled her enough to read it twice. "This is absurd," Lady Octavia said, and for the first time her voice rose, just slightly, just enough. "You would take the word of a copyist and a senile archivist over a member of this council." "I would take the word of a ledger," the Alpha King said, "which is why every account you hold, personal and official, will be audited within the week. If Master Orson's memory proves accurate, you will face this council under the same charge you attempted to place on an innocent woman. If it does not, I will personally apologize to you before this chamber. Those are the only 2 outcomes available to you, Lady Octavia, and I notice you have not yet asked for the second one." Something in Lady Octavia's composure did not break so much as it recalibrated, visibly the arithmetic of a cornered woman, deciding which version of dignity was still available to her. She said nothing further. She sat very straight, and her eyes, when they finally found Fenna's, held not defiance, but a flicker of something closer to fear. The audit took 11 days, and in those 11 days, Fenna was not returned to the cell, or to the lower archive, or to the life she had lived before the ledger. She was housed in the East Wing, under guard that was there, she understood eventually, less to prevent her escape than to prevent anyone from finishing what the trial had started before the truth could catch up to it. The Alpha King visited her most mornings. He did not command anything from her in those visits. He asked about the northern accounts, about what she remembered of the numbers, about her years in the archive, and then, increasingly, about things that had nothing to do with any of it, what she read for herself when she was not copying for the crown, whether she had ever wanted to leave the capital, why she still wrapped the bandage over her wrist, even now that the mark had been seen and recorded by half the council. "Habit," she told him on the 6th morning. 20 years of habit doesn't undo itself because the reason for it changed. "You could stop," he said. "No one can take you now for what's on your wrist." "I know." She looked down at the linen, at the shape of it under her sleeve. "I'm not certain I know how to be a person who doesn't hide it yet." He did not answer that immediately. He had brought, as he had every morning that week, a small stack of correspondence he was meant to be reading elsewhere, and he set it on the table beside her rather than reading it in his own chambers, which she had noticed and not commented on, though she had begun, without meaning to look for the sound of his boots in the corridor before he arrived. On the 8th morning, she found him in the council chamber, long after the session had ended. Alone, the candles burned low, a single page of correspondence held in his hand that he had not turned in the better part of an hour. She had come looking for Orson, and found the Alpha King instead, unguarded in a way she had not yet seen him, his shoulders lower, his jaw less set, the specific exhaustion of a man managing a kingdom that did not know how tired he was, because he had never once let it see. She did not announce herself. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a long moment, and something in her understanding of him shifted quietly, without ceremony, the recognition that the man who had stopped an axe mid-fall with a single word was also a man who sat alone with unread correspondence because there was no one left in his life he trusted to sit there with him. She did not go to him. She carried the thought back to her room instead, and did not know what to do with the ache it left behind. On the 10th morning, the audit confirmed everything Orson had claimed. Lady Octavia's accounts held funds that could not be explained by any legitimate accounting of her position. Years of quiet theft from a border garrison's budget, laundered through names that did not exist and titles that had been invented for the purpose. Fenna's discovery, 6 days before her own execution had nearly been carried out over it, had been entirely accidental and entirely correct. The council convened one final time. Lady Octavia stood before them in the same deep blue, though it looked different on her now, less armor than costume, the difference visible only in retrospect. She did not weep. She did not rage. When the verdict was read, removal from council, seizure of assets, confinement pending further judgment, what showed in her eyes was not defiance. It was fear, plain and unhidden for the first time since Fenna had first seen her seated in the shaded gallery, patient and certain of her own victory. "I did what I did," Lady Octavia said quietly, to no one in particular, "because I built something out of nothing in this court, and I was not prepared to watch it taken from me by a girl who happened to open the wrong ledger on the wrong evening." "You built it out of theft," the Alpha King said, without cruelty, only plainly, "and it was never going to be yours to keep." She was led from the chamber. She did not look back. That night, alone in the east wing with the mark on her wrist finally, entirely unbandaged, Fenna found she could not sleep, and so she went walking, and the corridors of the keep at that hour were empty enough that she did not expect to meet anyone, and so she nearly walked directly into him. The Alpha King had not been looking for her. He had simply been unable to sleep either, for reasons he had not examined closely, and something in him, the quiet, patient thing beneath his ribs that had gone still and attentive the day he saw her mark, had drawn him toward this corridor, without his conscious decision to walk it. They stood facing each other, in the near dark, neither quite willing to be the first to speak. "You should be resting," he said finally. "So should you." Neither of them moved to leave. "I keep thinking," she said, "about how close it came. If you had arrived an hour later, if Orson had said nothing, if the mark had stayed hidden the way it always has." "Don't." His voice had roughened. "I have thought about it enough for the both of us. I don't require you to carry it as well. Why did you say stop?" She had not asked him this yet, in all the mornings of correspondence and quiet questions. "Before you knew anything, before the mark, before Orson, before any of it. You said it before you had a single reason to." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, it cost him something visible to say it plainly. "I don't fully know. Something in me knew before I did. I have spent 9 years being a man who decides things carefully, and that morning I decided nothing. I simply could not let the axe fall, and I have not stopped turning that over since." She looked at him, really looked, in the low light of the corridor, at a king who had ridden through the night for a summons he could have ignored, who had crouched in front of a condemned woman in view of his own court, who sat alone with unread letters because he trusted almost no one enough to let them see him tired. "I saw you," she said quietly, "in the chamber, the night before the audit closed. You didn't know I was there." Something shifted in his expression, not alarm, something closer to exposure. "What did you see?" A man carrying more than anyone around him understands he's carrying. She held his gaze. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know what I would be allowed to say. I still don't, entirely. But I wanted you to know that I saw it." He reached for her hand before he had decided to. The way the word "stop" had left him before he chose it, and his fingers closed around hers. The first deliberate touch either of them had allowed themselves, brief and certain, his thumb resting once, briefly, over the pale mark at her wrist before he let go. Fenna. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it had in the courtyard, in the chamber, in any of the mornings of careful correspondence. I am not in the habit of being seen. I find I do not mind when it is you. Neither of them said anything further. There did not seem to be anything further that needed saying, not yet, and the moment held between them, unresolved and complete in its own way, until a door somewhere down the corridor opened, and a guard's footsteps approached, and the ordinary machinery of the keep pulled them both back into the version of themselves the world was still watching. The weeks that followed were not without their difficulties. Lady Atavia's allies on the council, fewer than she had believed, but not none, made a final, quiet attempt to have the audit's findings dismissed as politically motivated, a maneuver that collapsed within days for lack of any evidence to support it. Fenna herself was summoned twice more to give account of the ledger, testimony she gave plainly and without performance, in a voice that had grown steadier with every telling, until the final hearing closed the matter entirely, and the council moved, formally, to strike the treason charge from every record that had ever carried her name. She was offered, in the aftermath, a choice she had not expected, a formal pardon and a return to her old life in the Western Archive, restored and unremarkable, or a position she had never imagined existing, keeper of the very vault where Orson had spent his long life, guarding the realm's oldest secrets, a role created, the council noted carefully, in recognition of services rendered to the crown. She did not answer immediately. She went to the vault first, and found Orson exactly where he always was, and asked him plainly whether he thought she was suited to it. "You read what no one else would have thought to read," he said, "and you understood it mattered before anyone told you it did. I have been doing this work alone for longer than I care to admit, girl. I would not mind the company." She accepted before she told the Alpha King, which she suspected pleased him more than if she had asked his opinion first. There was one confrontation still to have, and it came on a grey afternoon, a week after the council's final ruling, when she found him in the same chamber where she had once seen him unguarded and exhausted, and asked him the question she had been carrying since the corridor. "You changed my rotation," she said, "in the archive, years ago, before any of this. I found the record when I was cataloguing my own history for the council. My hours were altered, so I never walked back to the lower quarters after dark. The changes dated to shortly after you took the throne." He did not deny it, though it visibly cost him to admit it plainly. "I did not know your name then. I knew there was a copyist in the West Wing whose hours put her on the road alone in the dark, and I did not like it. I told my steward it was an administrative correction. He did not ask why the king knew one copyist's schedule, and I did not offer an explanation. That was 6 years before the mark, before any of this." She studied him. "Why?" "I don't know," he said, and this time it was not evasion. It was honesty, plain and unpolished. "I have asked myself the same question since I learned the dates matched. I have no explanation that satisfies me, only that something in me noticed you before I understood what noticing meant." She let that settle between them, the specific, quiet devastation of a truth offered without decoration. "You are aware," she said finally, "that is rather more than an administrative correction." "I am aware." A ghost of dry humour moved at the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him, rare enough that she understood immediately how little he allowed himself to show it. "I have been aware for some time. I simply did not know what to do with the awareness, having never needed to before." 2 months later, the archive wing settled into a rhythm neither of them had quite expected to find so easily. Fenna kept the vault now, her ledgers open on Orson's old table, her hours her own, her wrist bare in every season, because there was, finally, nothing left to hide from anyone. The council had not entirely made its peace with her presence in its business. There remained advisers who did not know what to do with a woman who had gone from condemned to indispensable in the space of a season. But that discomfort was acknowledged without drama, absorbed into the ordinary friction of a court still recalibrating itself. Bastian, she had learned, over the months, to call him that in private, though the court still had him as Your Grace, came to the archive most mornings before the council convened, not because state business required it, but because it had become, without either of them naming it as such, the part of his day he preferred least to skip. He brought reports of small things, a dispute over grazing rights on the northern road, an aging steward's complaints about the new roof over the stables, the specific comedy of two lords who had not spoken civilly to each other in a decade, and had chosen, of all possible venues, his morning audience to resume the argument. "You tell me this," she said one such morning, not looking up from the ledger she was annotating, "as though I have any authority over grazing rights. You don't. I simply find I would rather tell you about my day than not tell anyone at all." He said it plainly, the way he said everything that cost him something, and she understood by now that this, small reports, matter of fact and unglamorous, was the closest thing to devotion he knew how to offer, and that she had come to treasure it more than any grand declaration could have moved her. She set down her pen. "I used to think," she said, "that being overlooked was simply the shape of my life, that I would keep records for other people's histories and never have one worth keeping myself. You were never overlooked." He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and something in the quality of his stillness told her this was not an ordinary morning report. "You were unrecognized. There is a difference, and I intend to spend considerably more time than one season making sure you never mistake the two again." He reached up and cupped her face, his palm warm against her cheek, and she leaned into it without deciding to, the way she had leaned into very little in her careful, guarded life. His forehead came to rest against hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence itself the fullest thing either had offered the other, more honest than any of the careful words that had come before it. "Stay," he said finally, quiet against her skin. "Not because an old law protects you, not because the council has decided you are useful, because I am asking you to, plainly, as myself, with nothing else attached to it." "I was already staying," she said. "You only just now got around to asking." He kissed her then, once, carefully, the way a man keeps a promise he has been quietly making to himself for longer than he has let anyone know. Outside the narrow archive window, the morning light fell pale and clean across 289 years of dust that had finally been disturbed for good, and somewhere in the keep a wolf that had once been dissociated from the man who carried it settled at last into something that no longer needed to be held apart from him, quiet, certain, and entirely at peace with what it had chosen the moment it told him to stop. If something ancient and forgotten had marked you as untouchable your whole life, and you never understood why until the moment it saved you, would you have kept it hidden as long as she did, or would you have wanted to know sooner? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Until next time.